bootcamp on the camp.
So first of all, before we get started, thank you to PSC. Thank you to Bootcamp. Thank you to Tech Systems. User groups are a really cool thing. They're really useful. They only happen because of people like Joe who want to organize them and sponsors. So thank you.
Yay!
Yay! All right.
Meow meow. I mean,
Three meow. Excellent start. We're going to talk about Webpack 2. This is an opinionated talk about Webpack 2. I'm an opinionated guy. Webpack 2 is a solution to a problem. Whenever I talk about Webpack 2, everyone wants to talk about the problems that Webpack 2 doesn't solve. And I appreciate that. That's good, that's useful, there's a conversation about it. But I want to clarify something, and I actually like to go back to one of the first marketing courses I ever took. And that was, somebody sat down and said, well, look, you can have the best styrofoam cup in the world, and you could tell everybody how it keeps all the hot things hot and all the cold things cold. But if your audience doesn't care about keeping cold things cold and hot things hot, it doesn't matter. All right, that's where we're at with Webpack 2. It does something really specific, and if you care about that specific thing it does, it's an awesome tool. If you don't, I won't fault you, but it may not be quite as interesting. So, what does Webpack 2 do? Well, it does this. Oh, by the way, this is like one of 3 slides I have. Everything else is going to be code tonight. This is stolen directly from the Webpack 2 site, although they have a fancy little graphic right here. You can do without it. So, the gist of Webpack 2 is very, very simple. We take all of this stuff, affectionately called the crap, which is that we have CSS and assets and potentially transformed assets and all of these sorts of things in the whole world that we have to deal with in modern JavaScript, and we're trying to bring it over to something static that we can serve. This is very contrary to how JavaScript worked even a few years back. Actually, it's a story I tell mainly because I like my vindication. But in, I don't know, going on 5-6 years ago, whatever it was, just before TypeScript was around, I was really big into the idea of having compiled JavaScript. And I thought, like, man, if we could just write stuff and compile the JavaScript, this would really be a big win, and there'd be a lot of good things about it. And everyone was a detractor. Everyone thought it was the dumbest idea ever, and why would anyone want to take this great language, which you don't have to compile, and ever do anything to transform it or compile it, because the greatest part about it is you can just type it in and run it in a web browser. Welcome to 2017, where every piece of JavaScript is a compiled piece of JavaScript. Everything we do is take a whole bunch of assets, a whole bunch of code, and we transform them in one way or another, usually for developer workflow, but a lot of times for compatibility for different things. So in this world where we have this plethora of different assets and a plethora of different deployment targets, Webpack serves a way to convert all of this stuff into something reasonably packageable, into something that we can deploy. So what we're trying to do with Webpack is tame all of these different assets and produce a smaller footprint of something that we can deploy and potentially deploy not only in the web, but in different environments. So it could be server-based, it could be browser-based. We could package this all up and wrap it inside a Cordova wrapper and deploy it on a phone or whatever we wanted to do. But the gist is, all these disparate environments have different requirements. Some can load things dynamically, some can't, and have different restrictions. Webpack is about letting you manage all those things without having to change your code for all those management. So what we're going to see consistently, or what we're going to try to see consistently, except where I've made mistakes, is that we have relatively little code change for what we're trying to do, but we can do a lot by manipulating how the output actually looks. And we can obscure intentionally some of the things that make this whole process really, really difficult and really hard by using Webpack to bundle them up. All right, so at its core, Webpack's a bundler. Any of you worked in compiled languages before you came to JavaScript? Okay, any of you work in compiled languages that weren't Java? Okay, cool. All right, so I'm going back to like old school terms that, you know, at this point, I feel bad saying that, but they are old school because nobody knows them anymore. I interview candidates all the time who've never heard these things. Did it today. So, in the old days, we had the idea of compiling and linking. All right, and compiling was the process by which we transformed our code into something that was targeted to a platform, and linking was the process by which we found all these disparate little assets that came together and brought them together into one final piece of code that could actually be executed. Because just because we compiled something didn't mean it was ready to run. If we were in C, we might be dependent upon a standard I/O library or something different. So we needed to bring all those things together and package them up to run. That's how I think about Babel. Okay, I think about it as kind of the linker for our web environments, which is that we're going to take all these things and we're going to produce a final output, which is a combination of this compiled code, which we'll see how that works, and all these different assets that have potentially been transformed. Now, one of the things that we're going to talk about a lot as we get further into the presentation is plugins. Webpack is turtles all the way down as far as plugins go. All right, it is built on plugins and it's built on templates. Everything, even if you don't realize it, is a plugin in Webpack. And what a plugin is really responsible for doing is having a target of something that it knows how to receive and transforming it in some way, sometimes really minimally, sometimes it's as simple as copying it, sometimes it's radical transformation, but taking something that it can target, transforming it, and then delivering it back to Webpack so that it can be bundled up. All right, so we're going to talk about plugins a lot. We're going to talk about them in terms of rules and modules, and then later on we'll do some fancier stuff. Now, what the real secret to this, and I lied to jokes, I was like, yeah, I can do a Webpack plugin, thing in like Webpack thing in like an hour. It's totally lied. Totally lied, but it was the way I got here. I need like 8.5, 9 hours. So if you guys could all like just hang out for a while, we can get through a lot of stuff tonight. But if that's not possible, what we might have to do is kind of bounce around a little bit and do a survey of what I think are the most important concepts, and also what I think are the most useful things. So what I've sort of done with this presentation is hit a couple of things. I've hit a little bit of stuff that's going to show you what's happening under the hood, and I'm hoping in a way that most people aren't really looking at things right now. And then second, I skipped around to a couple of common things that people hit in their workflows and usually trip them up, but that aren't terribly hard once you kind of get the big picture. And I thought we'd use those as launching points for discussion as we went through. I also took all the code that I'm going to show tonight and I put it up in GitHub. So I give you that URL as well, which means that even if we don't get fully to talk about something, you've basically got a whole bunch of different samples that you could take and play with and kind of see what's going on. All right, so that's my spiel. So this is what Webpack does. And then here's my other important slide. Now how to do it. All right, so we'll start there.
It's going to be the now
I bet you put a lot of time into this slide.
I did put a lot of time into that slide. I took several minutes to decide if I was going to have a slide there, and then I went on. Okay, so we'll kill that for a second. We're going to come back here to the very beginning of my little project here that we're going to work with, and it's a really super important project I decided to work with today. After quite some time of deciding what the dumbest thing I could possibly do was, I came up with this, and so I hope everyone's as excited about it as me. Couple of things. Webpack has an ecosystem, not just a tool. So there are development servers, there are all these sorts of things, and there's about 1.5 billion plugins, only 2/3 of which are redundant, that exist out there. But I'm not going to try to show all of that because I didn't want to show the nuance of it. So right now in the background, you're going to see I'm just running an HTTP server. It's just a basic one, it's pointed at the same folder. I just didn't want to get into the complexities of dev server setup and stuff like that. Do know for your own benefit that there's a really cool Webpack dev server that does things like live reloading and potentially hot swapping. So as you're changing code, it narrowly changes little parts. Does some really cool stuff. Kind of difficult to get everything you want set up into it perfectly, but if you do, it is very rewarding. But we ain't gonna do that tonight. So what we're gonna do tonight instead is start with something really simple. And that's just how to really simply bundle code. Starting point, we have this little project, which as you can see, my index.js does very, very little at the moment. It basically is a query selector, but that's expected, right? We want to take something that's a starting point and pretty simple. I've also, because of the fact that you don't need to spend your night watching me type things, I've gone ahead and copied all my commands. So the magic of television will allow me to type these things a lot faster. This is the basic command, and wow, that's not going to work at all. Okay, yeah, well, try and increase that in a moment. Our basic command, and I can bring it back to the other file if necessary, of what we're going to try to do here whenever we run Webpack. Webpack is just an executable. Most often, people don't run it directly on the command line. Okay, that's not how we're running it. We are usually running it by, and I'm going to turn up the font if I can. Sorry, I should have done that one first. I did the other one, so come on, give me half credit. All right, apply. Yes! Now I'll never be able to get to the end. It'll be great. Okay, so the Webpack is an executable, although most people don't use it this way. Most people use it through a package JSON or through some other mechanism, but I want to start at the basic lowest level. So at the lowest level, all we're saying here is we're going to run Webpack, and we're we're going to run it on my index.js, which is this amazing important file that was in the background here. And we're asking it to produce a bundle.js from it. Now, bundle.js is a term you'll see, and maybe at this point it's a year old, so it's like old school in the JavaScript world. Main.js is often seen now, things like that. But bundle.js is just meaning it's my bundle file. So what Webpack did here was it took this index file and it produced a bundle out of it. Now this is going to be the first of about 3,000 times tonight we go back to the actual code that Webpack generated. Because I want to look through this and see what it's actually doing when we actually build something. So there's a little bit of overhead, but I want to explain what things do and why.
That's awesome.
What's that?
A little bit of overhead there.
When you scale up a project, comparatively, it's quite small. I guarantee it's like 0.1% of the stuff that we're doing at the moment. All right, so Webpack is basically creating this little bootstrap file here. And the reason is that Webpack is trying to keep track of all of these different things that are, we're going to use chunks and modules interchangeably for like this much longer. But what it's going to do is it's going to take all these things, which are modules, chunks of code out there, and it's going to figure out how to bring them all together and resolve the dependencies between them such that it can allow an application to run. It's going to do its best to do that without putting the onus on the developer. Because especially as a system scales, managing dependencies by yourself becomes extraordinarily difficult. We have very large applications that I don't see all of in the course of a week or a month, even working through them. If I had to manage every one of those dependencies by myself, I would spend all my time doing that. So Webpack is trying to eliminate that, but there's some overhead involved in the process. So it's going to keep track of these installed modules. Now, when I say a module, there are competing things of what a module means in the JavaScript world. We've got AMD, we've got UMD, we've got CommonJS, and there's a handful of others that are competing for the win too. Not to mention native ES6 support for modules, things like that. But what we mean at its core, in whatever way we happen to do it, and we will look at some different ways of doing it, is that we are taking a piece of code that we want to wrap up and be able to sort of isolate. Okay? We want to keep it over, whether it's just for file organization, and we keep it over in a file place, or whether it's for a much more important concept like testing or something else. We want to relatively treat it in isolation. We still want to be able to consume it in other areas of the application, but we want to code it in some form of isolation. Okay? That's going to be my definition of a module. Coded in isolation, although probably consumed as an aggregate. So Webpack right now has very little to do because at the end of it, that's my line of code from index, right? Which is that basically, at the end of the day, it said, all right, I'm going to create one function which takes all the modules I have and figures out the exports, and it's going to run the one dramatically important line of code that Mike wrote, which is it's going to put starting point on the screen. Now, when I do this, I've loaded this bundle.js. So, wow, I don't have any web browsers open. That may be the first time in years that's happened. All right, so here's my dramatically important code for starting point. Things to look at though. When I look here inside of the HTML file, what I'm doing is I'm loading that single file, bundle.js. All right, and that's going to be important because that's going to be consistent. Sorry, get away. That'll be consistent as we go. We're going to continue to load one JavaScript file. We're going to add more and more JavaScript to the project, but we're going to load one JavaScript file over and over, which is going to be our bundle. Because like the linker that I mentioned earlier, we're going to be asking this thing to aggregate pieces for us. So we're going to load this one file. We can go look at that file, and in fact, we should go look at that file as we go through, because the fact that there's quite a bit of love that's going to go into this file as we go along here. Of course, at the moment, Chrome doesn't want to show me that file, but maybe if we can convince it, there it is, to show me that file. So this is where we're at right now. This is just core JavaScript that's been written by Webpack. All right, totally unexciting, totally not cool, but it's the beginning of something really important. And that little bit of overhead we talked about, and it is a little bit of overhead, is basically, in its short, and we could go through it if you wanted to, but the big gist of it is, it's going to allow Webpack to require and basically treat all of these individual pieces as individual modules behind the scene and do another really, set us up at least for another really cool trick. We won't get to doing this tonight, but because Webpack is going to keep these things all separate, kind of in its purview, it also means that it can enable dynamic loading, and it can enable these things to perhaps dribble down to the server instead of being served up as a whole later. But it still manages all that for us. All right, that's enough on that piece for a moment. So I do in this project, believe it or not, I wrote a little bit more than just that index, but it was a great starting point. And some of the other things I wrote inside of here were a cool little module here which displays some text. It's going to display this Romeo and Juliet-ish thing. I've got a formatter function, which is going to do a little bit of work for us in a minute. Okay, just a little template string. And I've got a giant list of words. Because since I was bored and trying to figure out exactly what I was going to do, I lied about the bored part, but I was trying to figure out exactly what I was going to do. I decided that the best thing I could do for this demo would be a Mad Libs version of Romeo and Juliet, where we randomly select nouns and verbs and throw them into the prologue for Romeo and Juliet, because it made me laugh a lot several times today in the course of doing it. And I think that's really important. It's also important to note that the singular of moon is space stations, because that's not a moon, it's a space station. All right, so these are my initial files. Now, coming back here, I can treat them as modules. What I mean by that is that although this is a chunk of code, I've done a couple tiny little things to it. In fact, actually, this one's probably this one's the easiest one to look at. So what I've done here is I've treated these as though they're ES6 modules. I've taken my code and I've used a particular keyword, which is export. And what I've said is that I want you to take this JavaScript file, but I want you to treat it as an atomic unit. And it's kind of got its own scope, a module scope, okay, a certain execution context, by which it's going to be defined in, so people can't just reach into it. But I can define the points at which someone's allowed to talk to it. And those points right now are going to be everything that I've labeled as an export. So I'm going to export a constant, which is nouns. I'm going to export one for places, adjectives, verbs, numbers, because you couldn't randomly generate those, and body parts, because you need body parts. So these are my randomly generated, and they were actually, I went to an awesome site, by the way, that you can spend a lot of time on, called Random Lists. Turns out they have a list of everything, including a random list of body parts. I thought that one I was going to have to make up myself. No, it's there. I did censor groin. I didn't think that was appropriate. All right, so here we can import something. So this is another module, is us saying that we want to now use something from there. So I'm going to say that I want to import something from words, okay? So words being the name of that other file that I have over here. So I'm going to import something from words. In fact, I'm just going to start by importing nouns from words. All right, and nouns was this object. Now there's two cool things to see here. When I go through now and I actually run that same command that we won't easily be able to see, but I can shrink this down. All right. We go through, and you'll notice that Webpack, when I ran the bundle this time, said, oh, I have to grab words as well as index.js, because it knew implicitly that I'm using words now, so it needs to figure out how to get that into this bundle. But the cool thing is that we can start looking at how that looks inside of here, which is over here in yield bundle.js. We still have our little overhead chunk, but afterwards, we now have something which is our constant nouns, and it's inside of this little function closure that Webpack has created. It has used it, and it has done this in order to give us an opportunity to keep these things separate and allow other dependencies, as we'll see, to be passed to it. But more importantly, these things exist in their own little context, so all the things inside of words are used. And then I come down here, and once I actually get into my real module, I still don't actually use them up, but I see this sort of words piece here. In other words, what I'm doing is that inside of my module now, words has been injected, meaning that Webpack is giving me a reference to that thing that I asked to import, such that I would be able to use it internal to here. So I could use it very simply now, and we'll see the difference in the two pieces of code. If I say console.log nouns, and I built it again, over in bundle, by the way, this is how I piece things apart and learn everything. I just build them and look at output all day long. So Webpack renamed this thing A, okay, internally. But what it's really done is it's given us a reference now to the words external import. And we have that such that if we were to run this application in our very exciting environment, we would see that, ignoring the stupid Firebase warning because Google, we would see that our nouns were logged out. Okay.
So it imports the whole file, but it only uses
That's an excellent question. I was really hoping someone would ask it right now, so thank you. Yes, because right now we are just at the beginning of something called tree shaking. So one of the things that Webpack does, and it's not the best at it, okay? It's pretty darn good. Webpack 2 is better than the original one. It's pretty good. There are other people out there who do a better job perhaps at this piece. The clear winner on this one is Google Closure Compiler, if anybody remembers that. It does the best job. But there's Rollup, which is competing. There's different ones that do different things. They do a pretty good job. When we're in development mode, though, and we're just developing stuff, Webpack optimizes the idea that we should be producing a development asset as quick as humanly possible for you. So it doesn't take a lot of time to try and go through and figure out what you're using. But if we actually tell it, hey, we care more about production, we're going to see two things, and we're going to need the help of somebody to see this. We're going to go to JS Beautifier real quick. Not JSON editor, JS Beautifier. Come on, really, like those two can be related. Okay, so here we go over here. And our bundle.js now is a couple things because we put it in production mode. It's a lot smaller. It's a lot more compact. It's a lot harder to read. However, the cool thing about it is that if we looked now, what we'd actually see is the only thing that's been included are the nouns, because that's the only thing that I actually asked for. So in this case, since we went into production mode, it tree shook it, which means that it basically walks through the dependencies and figures out what's really in use. Now, a really cool side note of that is that even in development mode, I can actually put something called, let's see if I get it right, output, hold on, I'm going to copy it because I don't want to type it wrong. Output path info, which normally you'll see why we don't type these on the command line because it's going to keep getting longer and longer. But the cool thing is that output path info does some neat things for us when we are wanting to debug the bundle.js. First and foremost, it actually tells us, we'll put it down here first. It tells us and adds a little bit of a header about where every piece of code came from. So when we're searching through this, we can see where the piece of code came from. Another cool trick too, which is that up here, it'll actually tell us, all right, here's all the exports you provided. Here's the ones your code's actually using at the moment. So you can actually see that. And by the way, Webpack has an extraordinarily rich stats engine, which it'll output data from you about its build process. And there are a number of cool visualization tools that will pull that in and let you see where space is being used and things in your project. They did a really good job at outputting like this sort of stats idea. Okay, so even though in development mode, we're gonna see all these in the code, it already kind of knows that we're actually only using the one of them at the moment, okay? And that's all we're really gonna be kind of using out of this. One good reason, I asked this question one time, is beyond performance, if there was a reason not to tree shake in development mode. And one of the other reasons that made a lot of sense was that sometimes it's really nice to set a breakpoint, and even if there's an object you weren't quite using yet, be able to still see it, because if it tree shook everything, this moment you set a breakpoint on that import for nouns, like it's like, there's nothing else, this is it, that's all that's there. And it is, I admit, kind of nice to be able to see something perhaps that's not being used yet and understand that, although it does mean that you have a slight disparity when you get to production. Okay, everybody get kind of where that's going? All right, so we've been very successful so far at importing nouns, and I think that's a success for tonight.
All right, thank you.
All right, we'll go a little further.
Is that quitting while you're ahead?
Yeah, exactly. Well, you know, it's part of it. But we are going to copy and paste, so you don't have to watch me type. So right now I imported nouns, but I'm going to go ahead and type out explicitly all of these things that we want to import. Okay. So this is just my imports from that different file. So I'm actually going to grab them independently. Now I don't have to. I can say import everything from this file. Okay. And you can do that, but that makes it a lot harder when it comes to tree shaking too, when you're saying give me everything from here, because you're now kind of like already compromising the idea of what could be used. So unless it's impractical, I like trying to be explicit about what I'm using. I also tend to use it for linting and other things because I can kind of figure out what's actually in use. All right, so I'm going to export nouns from our file, and we're probably going to need to use these at some point in order to make this truly interesting. And so we'll steal a little bit more code that you don't need me to write at the moment. Does everybody understand this syntax? If not, let's talk about it real quick. This one right here on line 10 through 13. All right, some yeses, some nos. So here's the deal. This is destructuring syntax from Es6. what we're basically saying there is that we want to extract the two objects, one called singular, one called plural, from the collection of nouns. All right, so just a shortcut to be able to get those. I could have said nouns.singular, nouns.plural. I don't like to, so I didn't. I'm also going to import toDisplay. And then I'm going to write my crazy little one-of file here. Actually, you know what? I'm going to hold up. I'm going to come back and talk about this for a second. I mentioned two things. Right now, I've only showed you one type of file as it sits so far. I've only actually shown you the ability to look at words as a sort of an ES6 style exported file. One of the cool things about Webpack is that Webpack sort of understands all the different module syntaxes and doesn't really care. So what I mean by that is that some people in the world are publishing UMD modules, some people are publishing AMDs, some people are publishing common JS modules. And that can be really, really difficult when one's trying to put together a project. So then we have tools that try to regulate that. And more commonly now, people are exporting multiple files and multiple types. But one of the things that Webpack does is that it understands implicitly that this happens to be a UMD style module, or this happens to be an AMD style module, and it just normalizes them internally. So even though I actually have this file, which is written quite differently, where I'm saying define words, and I'm potentially passing a function, and potentially in this sort of style of format, I can actually specify dependencies a little easier. But where I could have defined it in this module style, it wouldn't have mattered to Webpack, because as soon as I imported this, it would have normalized it to exactly the same code in either case, because it doesn't care. Okay? It's going to, as I mentioned, it's developer workflow. The goal is you shouldn't really have to care the way that someone else exported something to be able to use it. So export it, however, we're going to consume it in the same way, and we'll provide a common interface in the consumption side, independent of the publishing side. Without jumping into it, does that make sense, everybody? Yeah, go for it.
But is that a relatively new Webpack thing? Because I only knew Webpack from the first Webpack. So I'm going to try to reuse your words to see if I'm following you.
Go for it.
So if even if what I'm targeting may not understand export and import, ultimately, I can still mix and match, define and import and export, and it's going to do the right thing.
Yep.
That's pretty damn cool.
Yeah, it is very damn cool. I agree. Incidentally, just to kind of show on this side note, I could do the same thing from here, which is I could say, hey, import everything, and you see I'm still using the same import syntax, right? And I called it words-AMD. That would work just as well, because they're two different module types, and by the time I use them, it doesn't matter, because Webpack's going to normalize them. And what it's really going to do, if you saw that sort of style that when I was looking at bundle.js, it's just going to take all that code and it's going to normalize it to the same style. So by the time we're running it, we're actually running the same module, it just understands enough. And that's what I was talking about earlier, about how Webpack takes things and then runs them through something and transforms them. That's a big part of what it's doing. Taking something and transforming. In this case, we're taking one type of module, we're transforming them so that they're all normalized and we can consume them the same way. All right? Okay. Just in the interest of time, I'm going to leave that one aside for a moment. But what we should probably do is briefly look at this. If I were to run this again and go on without a big surprise, we'll now see display, words, format, and index are all used. Well, that's interesting because I only pulled in words and display, but format's also used. So how did that happen? Right, because if I go to display, display imported format. So because of the fact that I was imported down the line, it's been folding these things back up, right? So now our bundle is going to have all of them declared with individual modules and independent dependencies that can be injected into each other, and it's going to do them in the right order. And if we go and look at toDisplay, we'd see that it needs format, and that's one of the things that's going to get passed into display in order for it to go on. Okay? And these things are going to cascade up such that at the end of the day, I'm only just injecting words and display into the main module, but whatever needed to be injected down the road had to be. So when I inject display, it goes to resolve display. Display needed format. Thank you very honestly so much, and injected into there, and then that all resolved up, right? So that's what we were going for, and that's the part about saying we don't want it to be the developer's onus to go, the old school days of this didn't load. Let me go add another script to the index.html in order to get this working. All right, so we're folding those up as we go. All right, so last little bit of code we're going to steal from here for the moment is this amazing code I wrote called one of, which we'll replace later, which pulls one of the elements of an array. and then we're going to replace our awesome inner HTML command there. So for those of you who are dying to know, all this really does at the end of the day is it is going to create a object called words. And it's going to have these keys, p noun 1, place noun 1, and it's going to pull one of the plurals, one of the places, one of the singulars, one of these, and it's going to take all that stuff up, and it's going to pass words to display, and we're done. Okay? That's our massively important program that we are going to run. We're going to go ahead and build it. It is pretty awesome. Thank you for noticing. Later, I even add CSS.
Stop the madness.
But right now, we have two ninjas, both alike in dignity, in fair Bangkok. For our Mad Libs-ish beginning has begun of our Romeo and Juliet-ish novel of Mad Libs. This amused me for a lot today, just pointing earlier. We won't get to it, but I actually had it pointing at the random generator remotely, and then it was all kinds of fun. But I did realize that then I couldn't tell what was going to come up during this presentation, and that felt just a bit risky, so I constrained it to a word list that was relatively sanitized. So, yes, correct. Correct. All right, so if we were to look now at bundle.js, we would actually see that, while not much more complicated, we have some cool things going on. In this case, we have one of words, which is B, and it's telling us, because we added that extra debug information, oh, B is places, in case you needed to go look it up. And C, which is adjectives, and D, which is verbs, and E, which is numbers, and C, adjectives. So it's pulling one of each one of these, okay? And it's passing it through a function. Why didn't it pull one? Why didn't it have to do an import for 263 and 264? I don't see any imports on that.
They're defining
Going on,
somewhere
somebody
else. I
answers.
have no idea.
Was it?
I have no idea.
Okay.
Or D, whatever.
Yes, because they're already destructured. So up here, we destructured, we took A, and then we fed it in here. So we made two constants out of the original import. So at that point, it did the work to get A, right? And so by the time we came down here, they're just basically local variables for singular and plural at that point. Okay? So it's not going to do these things over and over again if it doesn't need to. It's going to do them as intelligently as possible. All right, so that gives us a place where we've constructed our amazing, incredible app. We are basically doing the really cool things of that we have pulled 3 different modules, and we've kind of pulled them together and allowed these individual pieces to kind of start consuming and be interoperable. Does that make sense to everybody so far? I mean, obviously it's very limited, but there's some really cool things in terms of what it's starting to do. Because if that's really exciting, wait till we keep going. It's just going to get better. All right. So this is all still going to get just a wee bit tedious, right? Like right now, we're running all of this stuff on the output. Now, fair enough, we actually can do some other things, which are pretty cool, including tell Webpack to watch those files. And this isn't surprising in 2017, but it's still kind of cool. Which is that we can just say watch those things with another flag, and when we come in here and go back to our code, and we say that we very clearly need a console.log statement right here, if I make the right syntax, because right now it's going to scream a lot, but if I do that, it'll be much happier with it, and you'll see that it's going to emit things in the background. Okay, not surprising, sometimes handy, as it overwrites things. All right, so that's kind of step 1. Right? We have the basics of a Webpack file up and running, and we're bundling something. But we're providing very low configuration info right now. We're pretty much just saying take this index and bundle it. We certainly don't have a lot in the way of external libraries. Everything in our code is kind of brought together. And that works, but it's not going to work for a very long time because it's going to get harder and harder and harder to maintain this. And that's where we entered the idea of the Webpack config. Okay? Now, Webpack config changed a little bit, incidentally, between versions 1 and version 2. In version 1, Webpack config was just a static object. So it was simply an object that got returned, and whatever you gave it in that object, that's what you provided to Webpack config. And that was cool, but limited, because you didn't really have all the joys of an execution context or things like that. So we're going to do this in 2 steps. First, we're going to show the relatively static version of this thing, which is the way in which that we can just compose it out of a static object. We're going to externalize that object, and we're going to show how it works. And then later we'll show how we can actually use a function to construct that object, which will give us a lot of flexibility in how we can actually build things together in the future. Because pretty much once you actually have some type of function closure, right, you have the ability to do pretty much anything you want to. All right, so let's go on and do some of those things. I'm going to close a few things down. Not that they're not exciting, but you've seen them now. You'll be happy to know that we're going to use the basics of this same application, so you won't miss it throughout the rest of everything we do, and it's just going to keep getting better and better and better. All right, so let's go on and talk a little bit more about how this thing is going to come together next. Okay. So in our code now, I want to move us towards a configuration object. Now in configuration objects, what's pretty standard, or what's a pretty standard approach in the world of Webpack is that there's something called a webpack.config. It's just a file, it's just a JavaScript file though, and the fact that it's a JavaScript file is really, really important because it's going to contain executable code that we can do things with. So we're going to start with this little bit of a stub here. I promise you it does nothing more than we've done so far, but I'll describe each one of the things that we're doing in here as a starting point, or at least as a beginning point. Although I'm going to have to insist that I open the right file, and I'm sorry that you all didn't call me on that. So let's go ahead and try this one step. All right, so this is that Webpack config that we're going to start with. So at its essence, the Webpack config is a single module, just like anything else is. It is a module that exports one object or function. So that's new to Webpack 2. Before it had to be an object. So it's going to be an object or a function, and that function is just going to be an object that represents all the configuration properties we want to pass to Webpack. Now, I did a little bit of work up top just to get it out of the way. I've done a require of path, which is interesting itself because this thing is executable. It means that in the actual configuration on the server, I can require other libraries, which means if I really, really want to write all my config using Lodash, I am free to do so. If I really want to build it in multiple ways or load my configuration from a remote server before I build it, I can do so. Do whatever the hell I want to do in this environment. So first thing I'm doing is just grabbing a couple things. Now in this project right now, just to keep it consistent throughout, it's a little different than you'd probably set it up in real life, which is that I have one top level folder and I've got a bunch of folders underneath it. And each one of these is targeting some different code. So some of this is just basically to say, regardless of where I'm at, always throw this stuff in the public folder. Just so that we don't have to kind of mess around with changing directories and things and starting installing web servers as we've gone along. But all we've really done here is say, I'm going to resolve the current path, and then what I'd like to do is I'd like to find the source directory from wherever I'm executing it, and then I'm going to join it. And we've done nothing else in here. That's just our prereqs. Now to use this is going to be a little bit different. Instead of actually trying to pass things on the command line like we did now, like here we're actually passing the index.js that we were using and things like output path, watch, everything on the command line. Obviously, actually probably we should show this just to clarify why that would be cumbersome. So there's a couple options we can set as we go along, and we can really actually set almost all of them on the file system, but at some point we won't really be able to see what we're doing, right? At least not very well, including, by the way, in case you really need your output as a JSON object in order to parse it and use it in some other system. Some cool stuff. So we're going to start passing it a configuration object instead, all right? And that configuration object will have the nesting of all the properties we want, and it's going to enable us to do a much richer configuration. It's also, if we think about it and extrapolate a little bit, where the cool part comes in, because we can start sharing configurations across objects. Maybe if we're in a company that has a lot of common configuration, we can share that, we can do different things, we can compose objects differently. So we really want to get to this configuration object sort of standpoint. So as a starting point, going back here to the original piece, what we're going to do now when we run this is that we're going to run it with this type of command, which is we are going to run it, instead of passing the individual parameters, we are going to pass a configuration and tell it what it should configure itself to, or what object it should use for configuration. It's just a path to that JavaScript file, which is the entry point. An entry point in Webpack is basically the point at which execution starts. Going back to your old languages, main, right? This is where we start. This is where we're going to start everything else. Now we can do anything from that point, but we have to end up returning either a function that can be invoked to return an object or an object. Those are two things that we can validly return from here. So if we take this right now and we run it, it'll be actually kind of interesting because Webpack's a little upset that we don't have anything in the configuration file, and I think that's fair. It wants to know a little bit about what it's supposed to do, and we've robbed it of knowing things like we wanted to use the bundle.js and we wanted to use in what the source was. So instead of doing that, we're going to need to put some stuff back. Yeah.
So you're basically doing this so you don't have the setting to define how you want it to run instead of it being mushed together, basically.
Yeah, I just don't want to put them all in the command line.
Okay.
Right. So I'm going to give it a config file because that way I can compose it and I can do different things. For instance, as an example, in some of our projects, it's really common to have sort of shared portions of configuration that are for multiple applications for the same client. Right? So we might be able to externalize some of that instead of retyping it in every project that goes along. We can now consume it externally and be able to use it. So it's just giving us a point where we can keep all the commands that are actually running separate from the idea that we want to run the command. So the idea is we want to build it. Now we're saying how it gets built is over here. All right? So what we're going to do here is we'll go ahead and again, because I am really long-winded, we'll go ahead and copy some things to make our life a little bit easier. First thing, and we're going to explain each one of these keys, and then I want to look at the code that's associated with it. Entry. Entry is the point, and there can be more than one entry point in a Webpack app, but an entry is effectively, for right now, going to be considered what our main is for this application. Okay? Where are we going to enter the application and begin executing? So we'll bring that over because that's one of the first ones that we're going to need in order to do anything useful. The next one, which we've done already, is output. In this case, I'm using output as a variable, which is going to be this public folder. So instead of giving it the full explicated path in the command line, I'm letting it figure it out. But we're just telling it the build directory, and then we want to call it bundle.js. And that is that dash output dash path info you saw. And the reason that that was called dash output dash path info is that's the nesting and the structure of what's actually going on inside the configuration. So there is a pretty good mapping of the command line arguments to the actual properties internal to it. So all we've done so far is pretty basic, but what we've told it is exactly what we had on the command line before. So at this point, we can run it and it will build because we've given it exactly the same information we've done before. We have just now done it through the configuration file instead of actually doing it through the command line. Make sense so far? Okay, now that would be fine, but that's boring because we want to do more than that. We want to do a lot more than that. So I mentioned that Webpack does really cool things. For instance, if you remember that first slide, which I could bring back up if you'd like, but it was junk over here turns into stuff over here. The junk can be lots of different things. In fact, the coolest part about Webpack is that there's no limit to the number of types of things it can be. Anything that you can define or explain, you can write a plugin for. And obviously there's a rich community of ones that are out there, but we can do more and more and more ourselves too. So if I had a really archaic CSV file from a mainframe system that I needed to import in a specific way, I could write a plugin that when it found it in that directory, it brought it in as a JSON structure. And that would be fine. That would be a legitimate Webpack plugin and a very good useful one. And those are the types of things I can write. So some of the more common ones, obviously, are going to be things around image types and CSS and things. In fact, what I really want to do right now is that I'm getting a little bored with our Romeo and Juliet-ish top up here, so I want to replace it with an SVG. And here's the thing. I don't want to have to worry about copying these assets to the server and copying them around and doing all the things that are associated with it. I don't have to want to think about it again. Literally, I'm making a public folder right now, and the public folder I made, I could zip up and put on a web server, and it will work. By itself, no other dependencies, nothing external. It will work. It's self-contained. That's what I want to do. So although I'm going to bring an image in, I'm not going to link to some image path. I'm going to let Webpack do some of that work for me. Now, how have we brought in every other type of module so far? Import. And the cool thing about Webpack is that we can import SVGs. We can import CSS. We can import anything we want. So we're going to do that. Over here in yonder project folder, I've got just a source for this SVG file. And that SVG file I want to actually start bringing in. So there's a couple things that I need to do, and we're going to do them in an order that should cause problems first because it's kind of my personality. So we'll go ahead and I'm going to steal this from this blade as a starting point. So I'll grab that real quick and we'll bring it down. Now, what we're doing here inside of our display is we're saying instead of putting that title in, we want to, we'll get rid of this one, we'll bring that back in a minute. We want to import Romeo and Juliet, or rather, we want to import images, Romeo and Juliet.svg. And we're going to call that thing that we imported Romeo and Juliet. Okay? And the really cool part down here is if you notice, I have an image, and this is a, is everyone familiar with, or is anyone familiar with, well, either one works really, template strings, Es6 template strings. Okay, they're a quick and dirty way to be able to make a string instead of doing all the plus and stuff that you would normally do if you were aggregating yourself. So in this case, I'm using a template string to basically build a little image tag and a paragraph tag, and I'm calling my toText function, which came out of format with those words. But here I'm also now setting the source of this image to whatever is in that Romeo and Juliet import. Now, if I run this right now, as noted on the troublemaking front, I get a bunch of stuff in terms of SVG, but it's going to be a little confused about what the hell to do with all of these things at the moment, because I haven't given it a lot of information. Okay, I've just kind of thrown some code at it. So it's reading and it's importing the SVG and it's figuring it out, but we need to give it a little bit of a clue about what we want to do. And the way we give Webpack a clue on these things is by providing it rules. And so the rule we're going to look at right now is this one. And it's pretty neat, actually. Rules is an array, and this is a change from Webpack 1 if any of you have used it before. But under modules, so how we're defining our modules, we're going to define some rules. And there's a test, which can be a function or more commonly is used as a regular expression. So we're going to say anything that ends in SVG. We want you to use a special type of loader called the URL loader. Now a loader in Webpack is confusing and trips up lots of people because we're used to thinking of loader as the idea that we load something dynamically. That is not necessarily true in this case. Most of the time what a loader is that while Webpack is running, this is going to be the thing that loads it up in order to configure it or transform it to something else. Okay? So we are loading up SVGs using this URL loader. And we're going to talk about this options in a minute. But we're going to load it up. So if we take this now, and just this as a starting point, and we go ahead and add it to our rules, and we'll grab them both, and then I'll get rid of one. It'll just be easier. All right, so what we'll do is we're going to go ahead and add it to our Webpack 2 config. And so we'll come over here, and as I mentioned, I'm going to get rid of the CSS1 for a moment because I want to talk about that one in detail. But we're going to go ahead and add this module loader. Now, if I did that right and didn't screw up the copy and paste, so if I screw up the copy and paste, we will get a different result than had I not screwed up the copy and paste. But what we get is pretty neat. First and foremost, we will now get my, not William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. That was an image I created all by myself today.
Good.
And by that I mean I stole somebody else's free open source image and crossed out the William Shakespeare. Some type of creation. So in this case, two blueberries, both alike in dignity, in fair Bangkok, are getting started. Now, the cool thing though is if we look at this, we're going to see a couple things. First of all, going to the public folder, which is where I'm serving all of this content from, we only see a bundle.js and an index. There's no image there right now whatsoever. And that's because what we've just asked Webpack to do so far, and this is configurable, but what we've asked Webpack to do so far is we have asked it to go ahead and bundle that stuff up for us in its entirety, meaning that we have asked it to effectively embed that SVG right inside as a type of module, because it's just data, and it can. So it's embedded the SVG. Now, sometimes you go, well, that's crazy. You wouldn't want to embed all of your images in a site. Although, sometimes it's not so crazy, depending on things, because if we let Webpack manage them as resources and let them download it once and serve them up, our footprint's probably not any bigger. So in some ways, it can actually be better, depending on the type of app and depending on how much we're talking about and different things like that. Obviously, this is not an absolute, and I'm not recommending that, I don't know, Amazon embed all their images in their initial download. But for this one, it makes a bit of sense. In this case, you'll notice that now all that happened is this looks just like the rest of them because Webpack made a module out of it. And now because it's made that module, it can effectively go through and provide that module to anything else that it wants to, right? So I promised you I'd come back to this one. And Joe, when you want me to stop talking, you just kind of tell me. Or
I was
give
just thinking,
Yeah.
if anyone would like a beer break, now would be a good point.
If anyone would like a beer break, feel free to take it at any time.
And
won't
I'd
defend it
just
if you
like to
in front of
say, take this opportunity to talk to Nick and at least say thank you to Nick. Seeing as he's sitting here.
me. And thank you, Nick.
Thank you, Nick.
All right.
Is this all we got left?
In the meantime, though,
Right.
yeah, go ahead.
I had a question
If you want
about.
some beer, get some more beer now. Now's a good time.
I always get confused when it says module there. 'Cause
Yeah.
I want it to be modules or something else. So I think my mental model is not matching Webpack's.
Yes. All right. So in this case, it is basically passing what this module is going to receive. In other words, it's giving this thing something that's going to say, like, you're defining my module, and then this code is attaching to the module this definition of what it is, what it's exporting. So it's not passing a collection of modules at that point. It's saying, I'm giving you a structure of space that you're going to define as your own. Now go ahead and populate it, and then I'm going to work with it.
Can you flip back to the
Absolutely.
config?
You
Was
haven't
it?
seen
I'm good.
my Oh, hey, Mike. Marcy made it.
Hey, Marcy, I felt really bad tonight. I was just behind him responding. I felt really bad. And actually briefly made me freak out and think I had the wrong day. I totally panicked. All right, sorry, go ahead.
Can you go back to the Webpack config because that's
Yeah, no worries. So let's go back to the Webpack config.
so it's at the same level of entry and output.
Ah, okay. I know what you're asking about.
So I don't think I don't get what module means in that context.
Okay. Think about it less, and this is a little bit of a lie, but I promise I'll help you clarify as we go along. Think about it less as defining a bunch of modules, and more about defining how it's going to be able to compose the idea of a module. This is defining the rules for what a module is going to be. It's not exhaustively defining them. It's saying, hey, follow these rules, and when they match things, you can make a module out of that.
Thank you.
Okay.
That's exactly, those words help me a lot.
Okay,
Thank
good deal. All right, so as I mentioned, I can keep going for a while, so please tell me when to shut up, all right?
I'll keep going.
You've got about half an hour.
Ah, it's fine. I'll use it and then some.
About 9 hours.
All right, so this option, I mentioned I was going to tell you what that does. And this is really cool, and it's a good example of where things are really configurable. I kicked this down to 100K, okay? And the reason I just did that, and maybe I'll even shrink it further because I don't remember how big that image is. But the reason I just did that is I have set a limit on when Webpack should embed something, whether it should, or when it should load it dynamically. So here, now when I actually do the same thing, what we'll see is that that isn't embedded. The embed size went down, but there's my SVG that is produced as a discrete object and kicked out into the build process. So it's still out there, by the way, and I can still zip up that directory and send everything out. But now I don't have to manage it, and it's not embedded now.
Isn't the SVG as an HTML file though?
It's not. It's the SVG as a SVG. I just happen to have SVG.
Okay. I see. All right.
Chrome is my
Gotcha.
default SVG viewer.
All right.
So yeah, understandably confusing. But it is, just SVG data intact. Okay, cool. All right, good stuff. So one more thing we should do while we're in here, and I obviously alluded to this because I pasted the code and then deleted it. That's one way of alluding. Is that I can also define other types of modules, and in this case, although we're going to define more later, or other types of rules around modules, we can define one for CSS. So now we're saying, hey, if you find CSS or something that matches this, we can make a module out of that. And I've done one other thing here, which is kind of unique, and I wanted to show it, which is that Webpack can have multiple ways to load a file that can fall back. So there can be the idea that I would prefer you to use this. If you can't use this, so that we can have cascading relationships in the way that we actually go through and use things. So in this case, we're splitting it between two things, a CSS loader and a style loader.
Is it bottom up?
It's right left, and I'll explain what that means in a little while. Because that wasn't what you were expecting when I just said that, right? But yes, it's a right apply. Okay, so I don't know if I still have an extra. You do. I do? So you shouldn't think I should get rid of it? That's what you're saying? All right, there we go. Whatever.
Linters in the crowd.
Yeah, well, I don't need a linter because I've got a crowd full of linters.
Just have all of us stand in your office.
Yeah, just all day long. Park, big tech. That'll be great. All right, so before we go and see this now, one of the things that we could look at very quickly is my amazing CSS file. I'm not at all hyperbolic, which was here. But in addition to my amazing CSS file, what we can actually, and probably more importantly, see now is that in our bundle, and I don't think to anyone's surprise at this point, not only do I have my data back because I re-upped my limit, but when we go through, we will actually have our CSS in here. Let's go through it. Hold on. Oh, I'll show you why. So let's actually run this first.
Different windows you want to fly through.
Well, if you'd like, I could just keep cycling. But it all depends on what you actually want me to accomplish today or not. Okay, so here's the thing. I had just screwed up, and that might instill momentary panic, but it's okay. I already know what I did, so we're good. I had provided a rule for the CSS, but then I suddenly went, man, this is weird. I don't see it in my bundle. What do you think a reason that I wouldn't see it in my bundle after I still defined a way to make a module out of it might be? I didn't use the damn thing. So I'm going to go use it now, such that I can actually get it and show up in here. So if I go back here and I say that I'm going to import styles into our actual environment, now I've done this. Now this has actually had a really cool implication, by the way. Did you notice here that I'm importing the styles in this little submodule? So there's two cool implications. First of all, styles don't come in unless I use that module, because they're a dependency of that module. And second, Webpack only attaches them to the DOM if I use the module, or the browser does, which means I'm not polluting the DOM with tons and tons of styles I may not be using and making the app sort through a whole bunch of rules.
And nobody uses CSS anymore anyway, right?
And nobody uses CSS. But when but after I, this way later on when I attach my descendant selector, when the app's been running for an hour, I can make sure I really slow it down all at once. So, all right. So in this world, now that I've actually bothered to import it, and I can actually run this Webpack config. When I do so, I will get my styled version of my Romeo and Juliet.
Ooh,
yeah, it is pretty slick,
look at
honestly. I Googled CSS styles that look like old books, and this is what I came up with.
Jackpot.
Win. All right.
And green.
So, yes, it's fantastic, really. All right, and this now we have two space stations, both alike in dignity and for Bangkok. Never gets old for
So
me.
I have a question. Is
Yes.
there any way to import images as a bundle that are not SVGs?
Yes. So we can do PNGs, we can do anything there's a loader for, which at this point, there's almost a loader for everything.
Okay.
All right?
You don't gotta use that wacky exclamation mark.
No.
That's good.
Nothing else with the URL loader, right?
Yep.
To have just direct to that image.
So what Jared's saying is that the other thing you can do is if we simply say we want to use the URL loader for this basic one, what it would mean is that it would just say, like, great, every image that's referenced, I'll dump for you in the public folder, and then I'll make sure I load it up for you automatically. All right?
The right path and all that.
Yep, it takes care of all the goodies that go along with it. Okay, so at this point we actually have something that's reasonably cool. We're building an app, and it's extraordinarily important. All right, sir.
So,
You want to know about the text? It's partially random.
so it seems to me like you're kind of breaking the idea of like decoupling like your style code from your JavaScript logic code, like because now like in your JavaScript code, which should be more of like your logic.
Look at you using all these judgmental words like should.
I mean, it feels dirty.
Well, let me ask you a question. Do you think, up until this point, once you load it in a browser, the browser's like, that's Jared's CSS, I'm going to keep it over here. And this is Jared's JavaScript, I'm going to keep it over here. Or you think it kind of did what the hell it wanted to make that work?
In any order.
Right, so I'm just kind of saying, maybe you're doing it a quarter step early, but I promise you, it kind of got there anyway. So all I'm saying, we're going to check it. All I'm saying on this one is that I get what you're saying, but at the end of the day, if you think about this as a compiled output, does it really matter? No, because you are keeping your CSS separate from your JavaScript from anything else. In fact, in some ways, you can keep it more separate than ever you could. But now, you're throwing, during development, now all you're saying is like, no, this is a build target. And just like you wouldn't expect to open up an iOS, binary and look at it and be like, not to see some data in there. No, this is a build sort of thing, and this is what I'm expecting to see is the data that's in there.
And it's
So-
also kind of the only way it knows how to do things is through importing, right? Is that true? Maybe
Well,
that's
you
the
can
wrong
you could do
design.
things like copy things around, and we could do other things if we wanted to. But for the most part, if we stick and play within the ecosystem, yeah, we do import things.
That's your true.
Well, then it seems ultimately it's more of a means of simplifying maintenance.
It's that, and it's also packaging, right? In the sense that, imagine a lot of our apps maybe get deployed to the web, and also there's some version that's deployed to a server, and some version that's deployed out into a Cordova app or something so it can run on mobile. In those scenarios, what we're really saying is that we can take the differences and remove them from code, so that we aren't maintaining the differences in code, and we can maintain the differences in build target. So we've removed the onus from the developer to necessarily understand the way in which it's deployed. And for other apps that aren't JavaScript, that's been the case for a very long time. You write your Java app, you test it on a build server, but in big corporations, the guy who deployed it was not the guy who wrote it, right? But what we've done now is we've removed the onus of having to understand that deployment from having to be able to write the app. So it is maintenance, but it's kind of a long, like all the way through the development sort of maintenance, if that makes sense to you.
So it makes it a little more build agnostic. So assuming you meet these criteria, it should come out in a predictable fashion.
Yep.
Basically.
Yep, and that's what it's doing.
I gotta go, but I got
Yep.
one question for you. So if you're using like Grunt or Gulp,
Yep.
does this pretty much just eliminate those tools?
So this is a contentious
Like a
discussion.
religious discussion.
I would say it is plausible to eliminate them with a combination of Webpack and just NPM scripts. That is not what everybody chooses to do, but at least from the build side, it eliminates all of that. But all these other tools also do a lot more things about how to move things around and what other resources we might want and move things first. And so it's a little different. It also, to Jared's point, it has a stronger separation of the idea of source versus target. So they're a little bit different, but I would say, and without being hit by anything, that I could successfully replace most Gulp Grunt things with this and maybe a couple of scripts in NPM, and things would work quite well. So that's the best I'm going to give you, because otherwise I'll get hate mail later tonight. Take care. Okay. So let's keep moving on. I actually love the questions. Thank you. All right. So you look like you're going to say something, but then you look like you're saying something.
No. I was so when you're importing the CSS here, it's treating it just like if you imported it anywhere, and it's just the CSS associated with the DOM. It's not actually associating it with the module you're importing it in.
Yeah, so we're not actually in character saying that we have done something or brought it in there. We're still injecting it, and it'll still end up on the DOM. But when it gets to the DOM is changed a bit, and the relationship of when, why, and how. Okay, it's got to be.
It's still transcript, so if you didn't include that module, you'd never get any styles.
Yep, which leads, if things go well and if you're careful, leads to perhaps having a lower footprint of your CSS for what's needed. But yeah, don't let somebody depend on globally on a style that's only going to get loaded to the module, because that won't work. And so there are complexities with it as well. Okay, as awesome as my demo is, I think we should keep going with it. So we'll do that. It is pretty awesome. I'm just saying. All right. So in this part here, this is pretty cool, but there are still some criticisms that I think we could go through on it. Number one, if you'll notice, over in this sort of world of actually, for interest of time, I'm going to show this, but we won't talk too much about it, or the other way around. It'll be one of those two ways. So right now, I am defining a giant module of words. That's JSON data, right? Why am I putting it in JavaScript? That's JSON data. I should have it external. So the thing is that, and I don't think it'll be a terribly big surprise, that means it's data, which means I can actually just treat each one of these things as a JSON file, and I can import them, and I can have Webpack make the module code out of them and actually explicate it, such that I can effectively import a JSON file. All right, when I get it, it's an object now, but I'm not actually loading it dynamically, number one, and I'm not trying to actually convert it or by myself maintain it in JavaScript.
Is that built in, or is that a plugin?
That is built in.
Because I know in the past you had to use like Json Loader.
Yeah, so a lot of those core loaders are part of the core project, right? So there are some that are external, obviously, but within the Webpack project there is a JSON loader.
Got it.
Okay, that you can actually.
Well, you had to like explicitly define it.
And we still will.
Okay.
So in this case, we have to still explicitly say what we want to be able to load. So right now I have those two, right? But if I were to go through here and say, let's grab this guy, you'll see that I can. And you promised not to look any further. So where the hell did I put it? Yeah, just ignore that one for a moment. We'll just come back to that. It'll be fine.
But you didn't have to put it. You didn't have to like do a separate package for that. It's
not a separate package,
but you just have to specify that you're using it.
All we're doing is saying that we want to load JSON.
Got it.
Okay. All right. So in this case, then we can start loading up JSON. We can start doing things. One of the things, by the way, to be careful of when we write rules later, and we'll see this, is that JSON and JS both start with JS. And so it's really easy to write rules that can be really confusing later. It's like, why is it trying to cross-compile my JSON? And that's really true. Okay, so I'm not going to show the JSON one. You'll notice that it's just going to be kind of sucked into one of the projects. That'll happen in a moment, okay? And as we go forward, I'll show you. I'll point out the line to it, but since I'm going a little long, we'll leave that part alone. Here's the thing, though. I want to get to some of the cooler things that we can still do. And the ways that we can compose things and other pieces that we can bring together here. So to that side note, let's skip ahead just a little bit here instead of looking at those individual ones. And let's instead say, and we'll skip those for right now, and we will go ahead and start talking a little bit about development workflow, which is that even though this works right now, it does have an issue. If we look in here and we look at the bundle, this is going to be the same as that bundle I opened. And you're also going to see that some of the, or if you can, sorry, I can do that. You'll see that it's using Es6 syntax inside of the browser right now for everything. And that's really cool because it's really fast and effective and it works great in Chrome. And maybe not so great in every other browser that we might want to use. But the question again becomes, should that really, in 2017, be a developer concern? Or should that be a build system concern? That I need to target things differently? And I and Webpack, not together, just independently, but together, think that maybe it should be more of a build system concern. So since we're loading up all this code anyway, and we're transforming all this code, we can do things like load up this code and transform it into 2015 code, something that'll run everywhere. Okay? And those are relatively easy things to do. So we'll show a little bit about how we do that, and then we're going to show a little bit of the cool things and the complexity that comes with doing that, because every time you add something cool, you also add something complex. That's just the reality of how this stuff goes. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and we'll jump down into like this guy here. Now, just to give everyone the level set of where we're at, for the most part, everything's the same. The one thing I mentioned is that now I was going to be importing JSON directly. So you can see that I'm importing JSON nodes. Pretty much everything else here is going to be exactly the same right now. Okay, so there's no big tricks or anything. I just wanted to go ahead and skip ahead to something that I think will be a little more useful for everybody. All right, our configuration should basically be the same, but we're going to add this node. And this node I'm going to talk through really quickly. And it's the Babel Loader. So is everyone familiar with Babel? All right, so Babel is, at the moment, the most popular compiler for translating JavaScript from one world to another. Okay, it's built out. It's originally a fork of the Acorn project. We'll see what happens, et cetera, in the future. But it's pretty cool, like 98% cool. There's 2%, and not me in a room with somebody, I could fix that 2%. There's 2%. So the Babel Loader is basically a loader, just like these other ones, like the URL loader or like anything else, but specifically saying that we want to invoke Babel on these files when we load them. So in this case, remember my JSON comment, we're saying load up any JS file that ends in JS, and doesn't just have JS in it, but that ends in JS. I could, and we'll talk about that maybe at some point, if I was doing React, I could say JSX files as well. But I want you to find anything that happens to meet that pattern, JS, and I want you to run it through Babel Loader. I want to exclude some things. Why?
You want it to run forever?
Yeah.
Yeah, I really don't want to recompile all the code in my node modules directories.
Watch a movie.
Yeah, no interest in recompiling everybody's compiled code. That's not great. So I'm going to exclude those and power components just in case somebody grabs this and puts it on their own project I threw in there, okay? But we're going to exclude those. Down here, we're going to add just a couple other things, one of which is irrelevant for this project, but I wanted to put it in here to show it. Cache directory is true, which basically is telling Babel, go ahead and take a little more disk space, but use an optimistic cache, meaning that if you've gone through something once, don't try to check it too often again. Optimistically cache things will make it faster. Works pretty well in development 99% of the time. And then presets. And the presets are basically, you think of them as plugins to Babel. In other words, and they should be plugins to Babel. Whether they are or aren't is a separate issue in that 2% we talked about previously. So in this case, what we're really saying here is that we would want to do, and this is the important one, everything, we want to be able to compile ES 2015. React is the other preset, which we aren't using right now. I have it in here. It's not going to matter for our performance. But React would say, go ahead and compile JSX code using React syntax.
Do you still need a Babel RC file then, or is that?
You don't. Not if you do this. So basically, by putting the presets in line here, you can avoid having the Babel RC, which means I don't have two places to maintain something. I got one.
Excellent.
Makes it at least 11% more likely I won't screw it up.
Like those odds.
That's how it goes, man. I'm just being realistic. All right, so I'm telling it what I want it to compile. Again, in this case, we don't need the React one, but I wanted to show you what that looked like in case it was there. You could also add things here like the stage 0 stuff and things that are totally like, hey, there's a possibility someday this would make it into a language, and you can compile them today. Although, be warned, as you go into the crazier, newer things, the compilation time just goes up because it's doing more and more and more and more transformations of what has to happen. Okay, so in doing this, we would now be able to output things. The rest of the file is basically the same, except for this one. So I'm going to get rid of this first, and then we'll come back and talk about it. So if we actually took this now and we went down here, and which one was this? This was 4. I can't read it from here, but that's all good. I'm not blind. All right, so we go ahead and we run 4. And if we look at the output of 4 right now versus what we've been looking at up till now, we'd actually see quite a bit of difference in terms of what that bundle.js looks like. And that's because everywhere that we previously had some form of destructuring, hold on one second. What was that? I didn't hear anything. What? Sorry. 4. Good. What'd I do?
I mean, that looks like ES5.
Yes. Does it look like ES5? I
Well,
thought I
it's
saw
all
some.
bars and
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah,
Sorry.
fours and all
Yeah.
sorts of
I see the word
You know what? I saw one thing
see the
that
word
went wrong.
function.
I see the wrong function. That is a good way to put it. Okay, cool. We're fine. So everyone's okay. We're all fine. All right. So we are now in ES5/ES 2015, depending on how accurate you want to be, Kyle. But what we've done now is we've basically made the same thing. We didn't change anything from a developer perspective whatsoever. Okay. Our code is exactly the same. But now we're targeting 2015. In fact, if one thinks about it and wanted to be overly clever, it's not overly clever. It's at least kind of overly clever. One could actually compile it both ways, and depending on who came to the server, we could serve up either the really small package that is all ES6, or we could serve up the older package, which was the 2015 stuff, and we'll all still have one set of source, but now we could actually be optimizing it for the client that arrived, which is pretty neat in itself. Okay, so application's going to work the same. But we're going to be able to potentially vary it in terms of how we want to target it. But again, important part being that we're not touching the code to do it. We're still importing, we're still using all these concepts. And cross-compilation in JavaScript world is not a big deal these days, but it's a cool part of the workflow. Yeah?
Can you be smart the other way, where it drops polyfills in automatically for you and all that?
You can drop polyfills in, you can do anything that you want to do. You just basically tell it what you'd like included. And there is actually a set of minimal Babel polyfills for really old stuff, and then you can build up from there.
So you're limited only by your imagination.
Your imagination and your desire to read through configuration files. There is also a upper limit to how long you're limited to that.
Is there any performance advantage to doing the browser targeting?
Yes, and it's big. So there are a lot of these things, especially in Chrome is the one I'll call out a lot, although others are doing a really good job too, even surprisingly Edge. But the smaller code is actually increasingly becoming native in the way that it's being used, and some of the things are faster in the way that Chrome's executing them. So it's pretty neat, especially things like let and const actually have different rules around how they can be optimized. So something that's a constant, it knows is never going to mutate. So it doesn't have to keep it in the same state. It can treat it differently. And so it can provide a lot of optimizations around that. But when we convert it to a var, when we compile back to ES 2015, we started with something that was all this information that we know it's constant, and then we changed it to something that could be variable, and then we handed it to the virtual machine and said, okay, now execute it, and it can only do it with the information available. Okay, so we've made it all slower in the process. So it's still great, but it just means that we now, ended up with something that's maybe not quite as performant, but still really big advantage. We wrote the same code, we used it the same way, we didn't try to deal with multiple formats, etc. And all of the embedding and all of the image manipulation, all that stuff just worked, right? Okay, so that's pretty cool. And it's really neat, actually, in terms of what we can do, because there's other cool tricks that we can teach you as well. Has anyone ever had a caching problem where maybe you changed a piece of code and it didn't change when your users went to it?
Never. I don't do that.
Never happened. You know what's awesome? All right, I can tell them a quick side note. It happens. I booted up an old machine the other day, and a really old machine. I thought I was going to burn down the place. I got it running, and I opened up Internet Explorer, and I don't even know what version it was. I should have looked. But it popped open the web page that was cached, which told me about Paris Hilton going to jail and some of the things that Bush was vetoing. Wow. And so, yeah, so there's some caching for you as far as what it decided to hold on to. And I would wager that's beyond any time to live anyone ever expected to have.
So how do you get it around this cache?
Oh, that's a great question.
I'm faced with the city.
We're here.
How can we solve this problem?
Okay, so here's the thing. We actually know, and we have been preventing this from doing a little bit of work it could do for us on our behalf so far. Okay, right now, we've been telling it to always make the same file name, which is bundle.js, and every time it compiles it. But that's not necessary, okay? We can create a different file name if we wanted to every single time we created the HTML, or they created this JavaScript. And that file could perhaps be based on the contents of what's inside of it, such that we would know uniquely if something really changed. And by that I mean that there's a hash. There's a way that they can actually identify what's going on in the file. So it's pretty slick, actually, in how we can go about doing this. But if we go in and actually take a look, we can specify for a given file name that instead of actually using just a default file name, we can tell it to go ahead and use a name and something it calls a chunk hash. All right? Chunk hash, and we'll get to chunks a little bit, I think, but chunk hashes are basically discrete hashes that are ascribed to a given piece of code or a given code unit when it's compiled. Okay? That is going to be consistent. If I recompile the code 5 times in a row, I'm going to get the same chunk hash. But if I make a change to it, I get a new one. Okay? And so that chunk hash will actually then be part of the file name. So I'll get something like, in this case, main dot, some hash.js. And that will absolutely guarantee that since I'm requesting a different JavaScript file at that point, in terms of what it gets, I can't be served from the cache the same one because the file names will physically be different. Okay? So it'll get around any caching policy. The other cool thing, though, is we can use caching where we want to, which is that if we know that the hash hasn't changed, we know the code hasn't changed, which means we don't have to every time expire the cache and force it to download one. If the actual hash is the same, we can actually use the cache for what it was intended for and let somebody use the same piece of code.
That's crazy.
It is crazy. I agree.
That does that for, like, if you have this set up for your dev server too, right? So you don't have cache problems.
Yep, absolutely. Cool. Okay, so we can shut up the chunk hash, but there's a problem with it. And this is where I talked about the advances also lead to complexities. Okay? Oh, I did forget one thing, and I don't care. Because I hate it, but I'm going to show you anyway.
All right.
Yeah, sometimes, like I said, there's opinions that happen. I don't know if anybody noticed that. And all this stuff is up to GitHub. GitHub would be a great site. Like, have a long day at work, you need a GitHub. I'm gonna go register that later.
Imagine the legal implications.
Nobody do that first. All right.
I'm already doing it.
I already bought the domain name.
Domain name bought, but I will sell it back to you.
You can just buy it in the terminal with now.
There you go.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, my domain.
All right, so inside of here, I did mention that the one problem, or not problem, but the one thing about actually having done everything in ES 2015 now is that if I was looking through in the browser for any of this code, I would now be trying to interpret back to the code I wrote to the 2015 code. All right, which gets sometimes a little tricky. Some of us prefer it anyway, but sometimes it can be a little bit tricky. Webpack has a rich and fragmented way of doing something called a dev tool. And dev tool is really basically a set of source maps. Source maps are a way in which it maps the original source you wrote to the compiled JavaScript code such that it can go backward and tell you what the original code looks like. It has, I don't know, 637 million ways you can configure this option. It's about 7, but it feels like 637 million. And they range in terms of quality and performance and how it generates code. Let's look at it really quickly. I will be very clear I am biased against this command to begin with. So if I say things that seem biased, it's because I am biased against this command. So when we actually write this, the positive theoretical advantage of all this is that now underneath here I'll see something like Webpack, and I can look at step 4 source, and when I actually go to display, I will see export cons to display, and I will see my 2016 code, right? Which looks good and is nice. To be honest, it's a little harder to set breakpoints in, and in browsers it is questionable how well it works, and sometimes it doesn't seem to refresh very well. Okay? Additionally, it makes the actual code, the original code I was looking at, all but useless. Because what it does is it turns every one of the original lines of code into an eval. Now, hold on. In this day and age, eval is actually damn fast. And it's really not a big disadvantage anymore to use it. But it's impossible to debug. Totally and completely, sir.
What about the cheap one? I always wondered about that. Isn't there eval and cheap eval?
There is eval, cheap eval, source map cheap, this, that, the other thing. 7 ways to do it. How about if I add a comma to the end of everything? Whatever the hell you want. You can add all these different source maps. This is one of the recommended ones, which is basically telling you that it's not terrible on compilation time, but it gives you a reasonable amount of resolution. The cheaper they are, the less precise you can be, meaning that you might be able to get information about what line you're on, but not what character something broke on if you have a long line. The more precise you want to get, the slower it is because it has to generate this map file. And if we go look, even for what we have right now, if I generated this and whatever, if we went through, the map file is going to end up being 150, 160, 170K for even a project this size to be able to get through it. So you can do this, and there are times it's useful, okay? Particularly, there's one which is totally crazy called like hidden source maps, which is really, really useful because you can tell it to generate source maps for your production one, but not tell anybody about them. Now, what I mean by that is that it doesn't tell the code that there's source maps out there, but it will still deploy them alongside it, such that if you happen to know they're there with everything else, or you keep them on some other server, you can actually set up your developer tools to say, point to the source server, but use these source maps so that I can take the terribly minified code and be able to interact with it. And in the case of debugging production code, that's actually really useful. That is the one positive thing I will say about this. Everything else, to me, the pain right now of doing this versus just being able to set breakpoints in the 2015 code just makes it it's a very visceral feeling is all I can explain.
The anger is palpable.
Yeah, it is. It is. The number of hours you can spend I just want to set a breakpoint here. It's all I want in the whole world. Nope, not going to happen. Okay, so again, useful, but be careful with these things because it is trying to do its best job to map it back, and they do get out of sync, and there are some other problems. They're improved now, and there's more options. If you want to, you can set dev tool and explore all the options. I explore them this way. Okay, so that's my comment on dev tools before we go on. Okay, so as I was mentioning, there is a problem, which is that if I want to generate these chunks, and I want to give the chunk a different name each time that I create the file, that's great. But I can't have a static index.html, which just goes ahead and says bundle.js if the name is going to change every time I change it. So I need to be able to get in front of that, and I need to be able to now do something cooler, which is I need to generate the index.html as well. Now, fortunately, that's totally viable, and it's not very hard. But that's what I mean, like, as we do some of these cooler tricks, they're worth it. They take a little bit more effort to get to something that's really viable each time, and then we have to kind of figure out where the cost benefit is on some of it. Okay? Stop talking?
No, don't stop talking yet, but just giving you a heads up. Maybe 5 minutes-ish.
Ooh, got it! All right.
Ish.
All right, hold on, a little light stretching. Here we go. All right, so we're going to jump to example 6. All right, and that's cool. Yeah, it is everything, but I will only show it to you a piece at a time. A big piece at a time, but a piece at a time. All right, so what the goal of this is, and again, is that we want to be able to get to the point where we can actually do some form of chunking, and that means we have to get rid of bundle.js, right? To get rid of bundle.js, we have to be able to understand how to generate things when we want them. And we do that through a series of plugins. So in this particular case, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the way we can do it with a specific type of plugin called the Dhtml Plugin. Okay? So what this is going to say, and we'll explore the output of it, is that we are going to say, when we generate a new name.chunk hash, please also generate the HTML that goes with it. Okay? And we want to generate that HTML so that we have a way to be able to keep these things in track. So if I come back down here and I come over to step 6 and run it, what we'll see this time is that we will get our thing still loading correctly, but if we look inside of our HTML, come here, you can do it. We are loading main.f3 something 999.js. Okay? So we have a hash. Now, if I run this again, and you can see the output down here, 999 and 999. I didn't change anything. Hash didn't change. Okay, I can compile it again and again and again. It's fine. Now that's cool, but it means that we are now loading all of the code, discrete every time from the server. And it just so happens that applications usually don't work that way. Usually it's the case that we actually have some things we want to load every time and some things we don't. An example would be if we had a whole bunch of libraries or something we loaded from the outside world. Maybe we don't want those to be loaded every time. So as an example, because this is the kind of world I live in, let's just say that everybody really hated that I had this one-up function. And that is like the worst thing that ever happened to anyone. They don't know how to work with that function, and they really need to replace it with sample from Lodash. It is an imperative. They must do it now. It has to happen. Okay. Well, in the world where that is the case, which again it happens much more often than you'd think for trivial, stupid crap. Did I mention it was trivial, stupid crap? We can come over here and we will do this real quick because it'll be faster. And through the magic of television, we are going to bring up a version where instead of being able to use my one-off, we have used sample and we're using it from Lodash. Okay? Lodash is an external library. Now, though, we are dependent upon an external library. And when we build this thing, we are going to notice that that matters. Because when we build it...
You're just doing all of Lodash there, huh?
I'm bringing in Lodash.
You're rolling the
now,
dice.
It will tree shake some of it, and there are things, but even internally, we're going to get some dependencies. We just went up now to having like an additional 500 and some K of stuff that would be embedded into our library. Okay? And so now we're going to be forcing everyone to download 600K every single time that we go through.
So the network's for.
That's clearly what the network's for. So as a last bit of this, as a sampling phase, I will just quickly review the way that that's handled inside of sort of Webpack environment and then see how it looks. And there are other things in here too that we can certainly talk about at some point. It just won't be today. All right, so in here, we are going to include something now, and it's another plugin, and there are lots of them, called a Common Chunks plugin. Now, a Common Chunks plugin is used inside of Webpack in order to establish, define, and potentially separate chunks, individual units of compilable code, into basically modules, or these dynamic modules that we're going to be able to load. So what we're doing here with this little bit of configuration is that we are going to define a couple of chunks, okay? We're going to define our externals. We already have our base definition defined, our main one, okay? That one exists. But now we're defining one that we're going to call vendor, which is very common, and one that's called manifest. Vendor is going to contain all of the code that we load from an external library. And how do I know that right now? Well, I have a very simplistic function at the moment, and this would be much more complicated for real. But I'm saying if it lives in the node modules, I don't want it in my main project. Okay? If it's something that I draw out from node modules, throw it in vendor. Then we have this thing called a manifest, which is actually the secret sauce that's a little confusing. Because, you see, these chunks need to know about each other. So if I generate my main chunk, it is going to have the name of the vendor chunk in it. Okay? So if every single time I change the vendor chunk, the main chunk needs to know about the new name, then I get back into this situation where I'm building everything every time. So what building a manifest chunk does is it promotes the shared code that has to know what the names of all the modules are, the individual pieces, to its own file. And then it leaves the vendor library just being full of vendor stuff, and our library just being full of our code. So even that little overhead stuff we saw, a lot of that will be gone now. We'll put those into their own files, and then all that stuff will be promoted up, such that what will happen in a common scenario after we build any one of these pieces is that vendor will likely stay the same unless we've changed dependency. Our main will probably change a little bit, and the tiny little manifest will change because it'll point to a new main. Okay? And so what that looks like, and getting this magic working is not that bad, but the first time you do it, it can be a little crazy. Oh, and I threw one more thing in here, by the way. What do you think happens when we generate a whole bunch of files that all have random hashes and keep dumping in the same public folder forever?
Gets a little big.
Gets a little big, so that cleanup one is just basically a delete command. It's saying clean up the damn public folder because I'm sick of looking at your crap. Kind of spaced out in the... All right, so we'll build 6 here. And in 6, when we build it, and we refresh it, what we'll actually see, really wants that style node open, really, really does, is that we're now loading 3 chunks, okay? And those 3 chunks, which Webpack created, figured out the right order to put them in, and created this HTML file for us. Those 3 chunks are going to be the manifest, the vendor, and the main. And when I continue to build things and go in here and do something, so if I go back and I desperately need now to add my console.log. And I rebuild that. What we're going to see is that the old vendor one was 50, or the new one is 50, the old one is 50. It's going to stay the same. So that 551 kilobytes is going to remain cached. It's not going to download again. The only thing that's going to download are the smaller modules of the code that I actually changed, okay? And so when I go in here and load them, vendor is a viable hit from the cache. No problem. It still pulled the same one. These 2 ones were new. And obviously, as I go further and actually build this thing in more of a production capacity, which you'll notice now, especially with multiple chunks, takes at least a little longer, and this is a tiny project, okay, because it's doing a lot more tree shaking. Same thing will happen. Everything's going to work the same. These will go down in size, but when we actually look at it now as kind of a capacity of things, we see that main is about 188K. Our vendor, it pruned down to 75K.
Wow.
Because it
did a pretty good job.
Yeah, it did a really good job, right? From 500K. It figured out what it needed, and those are our files. And mind you, this is still not right now compiling down to ES 2015. It would be smaller if we removed the cross-compilation steps. Okay, and has generated that index. So there are some other things too that we didn't talk about, injecting things, etc. There's a lot that can be done, and the plugin ecosystem is pretty vast. But this is the gist. This is what we're trying to get to in either case, right? Is that we want a sustainable build system that is pretty functional, pretty stable. I mean, it may not be the easiest thing in the sense of it takes a little bit of learning to set it up, but once it's set up, it's very stable, it's very repeatable, it works all the time. It's very easy to get things like test paths and multiple deploys and builds for servers and other things and different things involved in it. We do have the possibility of doing multiple targets, and if you really want to embrace the whole Webpack server infrastructure, you can do all kinds of cool things where when I change a line of code, it'll know just which part of what to load and send it back to me, and it works reasonably well. And in that Node 2, we can also get to the point where we can actually even serve, if we want to, these individual modules as individual chunks of code, such that you don't even download the whole app, but it bleeds it to you as you use it. So there's a lot of cool stuff that actually is in here and how it works. Takes a little bit to figure it out. The docs are much better in 2 than they were in 1. They still have a long way to go, but they're much better than they were. And other than that, because I have rounded out my incredible slides, let's go ahead and resume those. I said from the beginning this is going to take hours to get through. And there we go. This is the last slide. So hopefully that's not there. All this code is up. Actually, that's make it a little better, but you've got something to work with, and hopefully it's helpful. There's a lot of hard-fought battles in there that you don't have to fight with a little luck. All right?
Excellent.
Good?
Thank you very much,
Mike.
All right. Should I click the magic button?
Oh yeah, the magic button.
All right. Woo! Look at that.
Oh wait. Anyone got any questions for Mike?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I just kind of just...
Magic button doesn't matter.
did.
Okay.
No, don't worry about
that. All right, so anybody have any last questions besides get out?
So, Mike, so when I use Angular CLI, for example, Webpack is built in. When I use the Microsoft SharePoint framework, Webpack is built in.
Right.
So I use Webpack every day.
Yep.
I don't give a crap how it works.
Yep.
Is that realistically the future?
No. I think it.
I beg to differ.
What's that? Which way do you beg to differ?
I know way more about Webpack than I ever wanted to know, but I do React stuff, so.
Yeah, you know what? So I understand where that's going. To be honest, that made a lot more sense in the Webpack 1 days. I wish they would invert the paradigm in the Webpack 2 days, which is that we'd have more specific plugins for Webpack. Instead of Webpack being embedded in this thing, I'd rather see Webpack as on the outside and these things plug in. Okay. I'm slightly biased because I don't like Uber tools. I like to be able to go pick out something and use something else later if I don't like how it's working. So I don't think it's the future. It may be the future for certain tools, and certainly there are people who are trying to do that. But I think personally with 2, things are a little more stable, a little more easy to document and find help on. I'm hoping that we'll see more Webpack used directly.
I would actually rephrase that. I think it depends on the type of developer.
I think it, not only developer, but probably the framework and the things that you're inheriting. Let's face it, if we're inheriting a set of CLI tools, we're going to use them.
Yes, exactly.
So there's a lot of good reasons to go. I think both ways. If you have a set of tools that use that way, my personal preference though is I like being able to see Webpack exposed.
Yeah.
All right.
Plus, you can also go into something that's pre-configured and add in or remove what you want.
Once you eject.
Depends on how much they give flexibility.
Eject.
Yeah.
You're on your own now.
Game over, man. Game over.
Absolutely. With those, there are some that are very tightly tied up. And the ones that are very tightly tied up, you don't even get to see some of these things in here.
Well, the other thing is too, I mean, we've had AMD for a long time, and it was clearly never going to be, adopted as is in a browser like CommonJS or something in Node. But with imports, which a lot of these build tools are kind of based around right now, I mean, it's absurd that we're already seeing that in versions of Chrome. I don't know if it's Canary or whatever. Actually, there's a big rethink coming with what these tools do, how they do it, and where the actual value is. So when some of this is bundled in with the Angular CLI or the Aurelia CLI or whatever it is, those guys are going to have to rethink that as well. And I'm not saying tomorrow, but it's coming.
Yeah. Native supported modules is a big deal. Yeah, a really big deal. I forgot to show you one thing, and as long as I got 2 seconds.
And show them hot reloading.
No. It's cool, but I'm not right now. To config. I mentioned earlier that this could take a function, and I only wanted to show this for a second. In this case, in one of the last ones here, I changed it so instead of being static, it took a config file. And one of the reasons that that's exception, or rather it's calling a function, which returns an object still. But one of the reasons that that's so exceptionally cool is that then you can do things like this. I can put additional command line information, like let's say platform, on the command line, and observe it inside of the build such that I can do things like that, where I can now, I passed Cordova in, I believe, and so I can say, hey, this building was built for Cordova, because I can bring things in. The build piece there, if you look though now what I had actually done in this version, and we played with that plugins method, but down here you'll see that plugins is defined as, hey, execute these functions called with platform, and pass it to the platform, and that's what returned my plugins. So being able to have a scenario where I can have function calls that kind of compose it up. In one of my real production configs for this, what you'd actually see is that each top level node is just a function call. And those things return back and just kind of fold up. And so it's actually really simple to kind of go in and do things. And I don't have to remember what all the keys are, which is also kind of cool. That's a struggle. All right, sorry. I want to make sure you got that though, because there's a big change between 1 and 2, and it's a huge deal. We just barely got to touch it.
Reloading?
Yep.
Hot reloading? I didn't see that in there. So.
You just wanted to see that?
Sorry.
No. There's 2 ways to do, and there's 2 differences in what that means. Okay? There's live reloading, which really means it just refreshes the web page for you, which there's 2 ways to do. Number 1, you can use the Webpack dev server. Second, there is just a live reload plugin, which you can add to this plugins array. And in doing so, all it really does is it keeps kind of a little separate session open from the web browser, such that anytime you make a code change, it automatically refreshes the page. I find that more useful, okay, personally, in most of the things I'm doing. The hot reloading is cool, but it has limitations because it's actually trying to swap out a chunk of code. So and I'm kind of an FRP guy and FP guy, and so this makes things a little easier on my side. If everything's right and your application's not overly stateful and you did the right rain dance and brought your proper boots, it works and it'll swap out the module. But I have more problems with it than it's ever given me a ton of benefit. So
if you're doing that though, live reload is actually doing a refresh. So like if you're using Redux, it'll like blow out your state.
Yep. And that's where the hot module swapping is really cool. I
gotcha.
Right. But you have to be so set up to get that right. And I'm exaggerating it, but to be honest, the problem is that very few of the people that are, maybe I'm wrong in this room, but different, but very few of the people in general are doing something more Reduxy or something that's not as stateful. So if you've got random variables set in a module and you're mutating state, you hot refresh it, that module's get blown away and refreshed, and 9 times out of 10, that internal state's not going to match the external state of something else, and you're going to end up in a weird place. Yeah. So if you are set up for it, it's cool. Go play with it, but you got to be set up for it. Is that fair, Joe?
That is fair.
All right.
That's totally fair.
This might be a broad question, but how might your unit testing strategy change based on developing in this fashion?
Cool. Especially if you really use exports, it gives you a really good scene to be able to see where things break apart and where dependencies are fulfilled, which is really nice for unit testing, right? Because in general, what you'll actually see for us is that we're unit testing a module at a time, and we keep our modules relatively small. And even though you saw me using import in some cases here, I actually favor in many cases even passing in those dependencies when I'm instantiating things and using higher order functions, which makes my unit testing super slick to be able to do those sorts of things. But in general, anytime that you're going to break the idea of having a monolithic bunch of code, you're going to improve your unit testing. The big secret of unit testing, right, is that you have to. What was it? No, it's not.
The secret is don't let anybody know you do it.
There you go. An experienced man speaking here.
Oh boy.
The big deal with unit testing that makes it so damn hard for most people is that you can't unit test all code. You can't unit test code that wasn't constructed with proper seams to unit test. The analogy I used to use was that when we write code, it's all coupled together. It's like we bought a lamp, right, or we moved into a house with a lamp. And that lamp has a light bulb screwed in, but you can't unscrew it. And then that lamp is hardwired to the wall, and you can't take it apart. And the wall is obviously hardwired to the electric grid, so that means if the lamp burns out, you have to move. That is what happens with coupled code. And then somebody comes in and is like, it's great, I'm going to unit test that lamp. Really? How? How do you get in front of any of the things that are going to happen to do it? So you can only unit test something that has seams, and seams come from architecting code that's small and not physically coupled to other things. So I would say simply, even without Webpack, simply the idea of breaking things into smaller modules and being cleaner about not reaching outside is helping.
Amen.
All right?
Seriously, I mean,
I'm not sure if I totally answered it.
I had one. So I've been reading one thing or another, but do you advocate for breaking it into like 5 or 6 files, or do you just say like the one bundle served over? Like, obviously you split the vendor and the but you advocate for splitting it even more code, or? It's
going to depend on the size of the application and the frequency of load. Mm-hmm. So if I need to load all those things, then I'm just being silly, if they're all going to change at the same interval. So if they change at different intervals such that some change very infrequently and some change more frequently, then it makes sense to break it because the overhead's not that great. But if they're going to change frequently, all of them, or incongruently, then it's hard to judge that. One thing we didn't talk about, sorry, I want to jump back to that for 1
You
second.
want to go, I can tell. Yeah.
Well, was that, yeah, I was back. We didn't get a chance to talk about two other things that I use. In fact, I've got a whole DI framework built around this crap, but that I use like quite a bit. Is that Webpack will allow you to do not only aliasing, but providing and defining of things. And providing basically means that I can kind of say, when you find this dependency, swap it out with this one. Now, if you can imagine, that's infinitely helpful for even when we've imported things when we get to unit testing, because we can do a whole lot of stuff like that, where at build time we can also say it. Now, in a perfect world, we aren't so hardly dependent upon all these things that we have to separate it with the surgical precision of a chainsaw that it is to rebuild the whole build system in order to test that thing. But if you need to, it's really handy to be able to say like, yep, wipe that out, put that in. As I mentioned, I actually do that all the time with build target stuff, which I just used it here to show a label of what I built. But we have entire modules that have to work differently in the browser versus if it's deployed in Cordova. Hey, what an awesome way to basically say, tell me what my environment is, got it. Here's your modules for this dependency this time. Here's your modules for this dependency this time, and everything else still works. Really powerful when it comes to that. Could be better, but still powerful. Told you I could go on for like 9 hours. I wasn't kidding. Yep.
All right. So actually,
quick question, please.
Let Steve ask his question.
Can I ask my question?
Yeah.
So
last one. Yeah.
Did I hear you say in this kind of situation where you've got your plugins, you would normally abstract this out into like little functions, which would say something like, I want to stringify things, I want to do X kinds of things, and then you just call all these functions in your
pull down.
config?
Close your eyes until I finish typing this path. Okay. Now everyone can open them again. All right. So as an example, here is my config for a client thing. To HTML Webpack plugin config, which happens to be a module which does nothing but handles the HTML Webpack configuration, right? Such that I can have these individual little pieces that do work and aggregate up to one node in that configuration. And they can be as complicated or simple as I want them to be.
And you can reuse them.
And I can reuse them all over, and I can provide configuration to them because they're functions, and I can do whatever I want.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
So thank you very much indeed, Mike. That's really